Have you ever felt completely invisible? Like the world just forgot you existed? Maybe you were passed over for a promotion. Maybe your family underestimated you. Maybe everyone around you got the spotlight while you were stuck doing the boring, thankless work nobody else wanted to do. If that sounds familiar, then you already have something in common with one of the most powerful kings who ever lived. His name was David. And before he wore a crown, before armies marched under his command, before his name became legendary, he was just a kid in a field watching sheep. Nobody expected anything from him. His own father almost forgot to mention he existed. But God had other plans, and the journey from that dusty hillside to the throne of Israel is one of the wildest, most dramatic, most heartbreaking stories you will ever hear. This is not a fairy tale. David was not some flawless superhero. He made terrible mistakes. He broke his own rules. He hurt people he loved. And yet, through all of it, something in his heart kept pulling him back toward God. That tension between greatness and failure is exactly what makes his story worth telling. So let's start at the very beginning. Picture a small town called Bethlehem, sitting on the outskirts of Jerusalem. It was not a place anyone would have called important. No major trade routes ran through it. No powerful families called it home. It was just a quiet little settlement where people raised livestock and minded their own business. In this town lived a man named Jesse. He had 8 sons. 7 of them were grown men with strong builds and impressive reputations. The 8th was the youngest, a teenager named David, and he spent most of his time out in the fields, alone with the sheep. Now, while David was busy with his daily routine, something extraordinary was happening behind the scenes. God spoke to the prophet Samuel and gave him a mission. Go to Bethlehem, go to the house of Jesse. I have chosen one of his sons to be the next king of Israel. This was a big deal. At the time, Israel already had a king named Saul, but Saul had disobeyed God repeatedly, and God had decided to replace him. Samuel's job was to find and anoint the new king in secret. So Samuel traveled to Bethlehem and arrived at Jesse's house. One by one, Jesse's sons were brought forward. The oldest, Eliab, walked in first. He was tall, strong, and looked every bit like a king. Samuel took one look at him and thought, "This has to be the one." But God said no. "Do not look at his appearance or his height. I have rejected him. The Lord does not see as humans see. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." One after another, 7 sons passed before Samuel, and one after another God said no to every single one of them. Samuel was confused. He turned to Jesse and asked, "Are these all the sons you have?" Jesse hesitated. "Well, there is still the youngest," he said, "but he is out tending the sheep." You can almost hear the dismissal in Jesse's voice. The youngest, the one nobody thought to invite, the one out doing the job nobody else wanted. Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." When David finally walked in from the fields, he was young, with a ruddy complexion and bright eyes. He did not look like a warrior. He did not look like a king. But the moment he stepped into the room, God spoke to Samuel and said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." In 1 Samuel 16:13, we read that Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed David right there, in front of all his brothers. And from that day forward, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Now think about this for a second. David's brothers had just watched their little brother get anointed by a prophet. The kid who herded sheep, the kid they probably teased and overlooked. He was now marked as the future king of Israel. But here is the thing. Nothing changed right away. David did not march off to a palace. There was no parade, no ceremony. He went right back to the fields, right back to the sheep. From the outside, his life looked exactly the same as it did yesterday. But on the inside, everything was different. The Spirit of God was with him, and a slow transformation had begun. And those years in the fields were not wasted time. Think about what David was actually learning out there. He was alone for long stretches, responsible for the safety of every animal in his care. When a lion came after the flock, David fought it off. When a bear attacked, David killed it with his own hands. He was developing courage, resourcefulness, and a deep dependence on God, all in a place where nobody was watching. God was training David for something massive, and David had no idea. Meanwhile, back at the royal court, things were falling apart for King Saul. 1 Samuel 16:14 tells us that the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit began to torment him. The king was restless, anxious, and unstable. His servants, desperate for a solution, suggested they find someone who could play music to calm him down. And guess whose name came up? One of the servants described David as a skilled harp player, a brave young man, a good speaker, and someone the Lord was clearly with. Saul agreed, and David was summoned to the palace. So just like that, the shepherd boy who had been invisible to everyone was now standing in the king's court, playing music to soothe the king's troubled mind. Saul liked David so much that he made him his personal armor-bearer. Do you see what was happening here? God was moving pieces on a chessboard that nobody else could see. David's years of practicing the harp alone in the fields had opened a door straight into the center of power. He was learning how a kingdom operated, watching how decisions were made, studying leadership from the inside. All because he had been faithful with the small, unseen things. But the moment that would truly launch David into the spotlight was still ahead. Let's talk about Goliath. In 1 Samuel 17, we find the Israelite army camped on one side of a valley, facing the Philistine army on the other side. And every day, a Philistine champion named Goliath walked out into the open ground between the two armies and issued a challenge. Goliath was enormous. The text says he stood about 3 meters tall. His armor alone weighed over 50 kilograms. The iron point on his spear was like a weaver's beam. He was covered head to toe in bronze, and he had a shield bearer walking in front of him. For 40 straight days, Goliath came out and shouted the same thing. "Send me one man, let him fight me. If he wins, we will be your servants. If I win, you will be ours." And for 40 straight days, not a single Israelite soldier stepped forward. They were terrified. Even Saul, the tallest man in Israel, and the one who should have been leading the charge, stayed in his tent. Now David, at this point, had gone back to tending sheep for a while. His father Jesse sent him to the battlefield to bring food to his older brothers. When David arrived and heard Goliath's challenge echoing across the valley, his reaction was completely different from everyone else's. He was not scared, he was offended. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine," David asked, "that he should defy the armies of the living God?" His oldest brother Eliab overheard him and snapped at him. "Why have you come down here? Who is watching the sheep? I know how conceited you are. You just came to watch the battle." But David was not there to watch. He went straight to Saul and volunteered to fight Goliath himself. Saul looked at this teenager and said what any reasonable person would say. "You cannot go against this Philistine. You are just a boy. He has been a warrior since his youth." David's response is one of the greatest moments in the entire Bible. He said, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul did not have a better option. He offered David his own armor, but David tried it on and could barely move. He was not a soldier, he was a shepherd. So he took it off, picked up 5 smooth stones from a nearby stream, grabbed his sling, and walked out to face the giant. The contrast was almost absurd. On one side, a professional warrior in full bronze armor with a massive spear and a shield bearer. On the other side, a teenager with a sling and a handful of rocks. Goliath looked at David and was insulted. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" He cursed David by his gods and said, "Come here, and I will give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David did not flinch. He shouted back, "You come against me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel." Then David ran toward Goliath, not away, toward him. He reached into his bag, loaded a stone into his sling, and let it fly. The stone hit Goliath square in the forehead. The giant crashed face first into the dirt. He was dead before he hit the ground. The entire Philistine army turned and ran. The Israelites charged after them, and what had been a terrifying stalemate turned into a total rout. David went from unknown shepherd boy to national hero overnight. The whole nation was buzzing. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Soldiers wanted to serve under him. Families told their children about the boy who killed the giant. Women in the streets sang about him. "Saul has slain his thousands," they chanted, "and David his tens of thousands." David's victory did something to the collective spirit of Israel. For 40 days, the entire army had been paralyzed by fear. One teenager with a sling changed everything. The lesson was not lost on the people. If God could use a shepherd boy to take down a 9-foot warrior, then nothing was impossible. But here is where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. That song, the one the women were singing, would change everything. See, Saul heard those lyrics and did not take them well, not well at all. In 1 Samuel 18:8 and 9, we read that Saul was furious. "They have credited David with tens of thousands. He thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom?" From that moment on, Saul watched David with suspicion, and it did not take long for suspicion to turn into something much darker. But before we get into that, we need to talk about one of the most remarkable friendships in the entire Bible. Jonathan was Saul's son. He was the heir to the throne. By every worldly calculation, David should have been his rival. But instead, something happened between them that went far deeper than politics. 1 Samuel 18:1 says that after David finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. This was not casual. Jonathan took off his own robe, his tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt, and gave them all to David. In the culture of that time, this was a public declaration. The crown prince was handing over the symbols of his authority to a shepherd's son. Jonathan recognized something in David that his own father refused to see. He saw the hand of God on this young man, and instead of fighting it, he embraced it. That friendship would soon be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. As David continued to succeed in every mission Saul gave him, the king's jealousy boiled over. One day, while David was playing the harp in Saul's house, the king suddenly hurled a spear at him. Twice. David dodged both times and escaped. This was not a momentary outburst. It was a pattern. Saul began actively plotting to kill David. He tried using his own daughter as bait. Saul offered his daughter Michal in marriage to David, but with a condition designed to get David killed. He demanded 100 Philistine foreskins as a bride price, fully expecting David to die trying to collect them. David did not die. He brought back 200. Saul had no choice but to give Michal to David, but the marriage did not stop the king's hatred. It only made it worse. Saul saw that Michal loved David, and it frightened him even more. Eventually, Saul dropped all pretense. In 1 Samuel 19:1, he openly told Jonathan and his officials to kill David. Jonathan, loyal friend that he was, immediately warned David and then went to his father to plead David's case. "Let not the king do wrong to his servant David," Jonathan argued. "He has not wronged you. What he has done has benefited you greatly. He risked his life when he killed the Philistine, and the Lord won a great victory for all Israel. You saw it and were glad. Why would you do wrong to an innocent man by killing him for no reason?" Saul relented briefly. He swore, "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death." But the peace did not last. Before long, the evil spirit returned, and Saul threw another spear at David while he was playing the harp. This time, David barely escaped with his life. Saul sent soldiers to David's house with orders to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him that night, "If you do not run for your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed." She lowered David through a window, and he disappeared into the darkness. And just like that, the hero of Israel became a fugitive in his own country. David's years on the run were brutal. He had no army. He had no resources. He had the most powerful man in the country trying to kill him, and every day was a fight for survival. His first stop was the priest Ahimelech at Nob. David lied about being on a secret mission from the king. Ahimelech, not knowing the truth, gave David consecrated bread and the sword of Goliath. It seemed like a small, insignificant moment. But Doeg the Edomite, one of Saul's servants, was there watching. He later reported the incident to Saul, and Saul ordered the execution of Ahimelech and 84 other priests at Nob. 84 priests killed because they unknowingly helped a fugitive. The blood of that massacre would haunt David for the rest of his life. From Nob, David fled to Gath, which was Philistine territory. This was the last place anyone would expect an Israelite hero to go. When the Philistines recognized him, David pretended to be insane, scratching marks on the doors and drooling into his beard. They let him go, thinking he was a madman. David then retreated to the cave of Adullam, and something remarkable started happening. People found him there. 1 Samuel 22:2 says that everyone who was in distress, in debt, or discontented gathered to him. About 400 men. David became their leader. Think about this. The future king of Israel was hiding in a cave, surrounded by a ragtag group of outcasts and misfits. These were not trained soldiers. These were men who had been chewed up by life. Debtors running from creditors, people who had been displaced or mistreated, guys at the end of their rope with nowhere else to go. And David took them in, organized them, trained them, and turned them into a fighting force that would eventually become the core of his army. This was not the royal court. This was not a palace. This was the school of hard knocks, and David was learning leadership the hard way. He was learning how to inspire men who had nothing left to lose. He was learning how to build loyalty through shared hardship. These were lessons no palace education could have taught him. Saul hunted David relentlessly. He committed thousands of soldiers to tracking down one man. The pursuit dragged on for years, pushing David from one hiding place to the next, through deserts and mountains and wilderness. But during this dark period, something happened that revealed the true depth of David's character. Twice David had Saul completely at his mercy, and twice he refused to kill him. The first time was in the cave at En-Gedi. Saul went into the cave to relieve himself, completely unaware that David and his men were hiding in the back. David's men whispered excitedly, "This is the day the Lord spoke about. He has delivered your enemy into your hands." David crept forward in the darkness, but instead of plunging a blade into Saul's back, he quietly cut off a corner of the king's robe, and even that small act tormented his conscience. Afterward, David told his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." The second opportunity came when David snuck into Saul's camp at night and found the king sleeping, with his spear stuck in the ground beside his head. David's companion Abishai said, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Let me pin him to the ground with one thrust." David said, "No. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. but the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed." Instead, David took Saul's spear and water jug and left. The next morning, he called out to Saul from a safe distance and showed him the proof. He could have killed the king. He chose not to. This is what separated David from so many other leaders throughout history. He refused to take the kingdom by force, even when he had every right and every opportunity to do so. He trusted that God would fulfill his promise in God's own time. During these years of exile, David poured out his heart in prayer and song. Many of the Psalms we read today were born in those desperate, lonely, frightening moments when David was running for his life with nowhere safe to turn. The raw honesty of those Psalms, the fear, the doubt, the anger, the trust that came from real suffering. Every word was earned. When David wrote, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," he was writing as a shepherd himself who understood exactly what it meant to guide defenseless creatures through dangerous terrain. When he wrote, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil," he was writing from an actual valley, with actual death closing in on every side. These were not abstract theological ideas. They were survival prayers, cried out in caves and deserts and mountain passes, while soldiers searched for him in the darkness. That is what gives the Psalms their power. They were forged in fire. Saul's pursuit of David ended the only way it could. In a battle against the Philistines on Mount Gilboa, the Israelite army was crushed. Saul's sons, including Jonathan, were killed. Saul, wounded and desperate, fell on his own sword rather than be captured. When the news reached David, his reaction shocked everyone. There was no celebration, no relief, no satisfaction. David tore his clothes and wept. He fasted until evening. Then he composed a lament that is one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking passages in the Bible. In 2 Samuel 1:19 through 24, David sang, "Your glory, O Israel, lies slain on your heights. How the mighty have fallen." Saul and Jonathan. In life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. David mourned the man who had spent years trying to kill him. He honored Saul's memory and grieved deeply for Jonathan. That tells you everything you need to know about the kind of man David was. With Saul dead, you might think David immediately became king. But it was not that simple. The first thing David did was ask God for direction. In 2 Samuel 2:1, David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" And the Lord said, "Go." David asked, "Where shall I go?" And the Lord answered, "To Hebron." So David went to Hebron, and the men of Judah anointed him king over their tribe, but only their tribe. The rest of Israel followed Abner, the commander of Saul's army, who had set up Saul's son Ishbosheth as king over the northern tribes. This was not the clean, triumphant coronation you might expect. Israel was now a divided nation. David controlled Judah in the south. Ishbosheth, propped up by Abner's military strength, held the north. Two kings, two capitals, one country tearing itself apart. What followed was a long, grinding civil war. 2 Samuel 3:1 summarizes it well. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. During this period, David refused to escalate. He did not launch major offensives against the northern tribes. He waited. He governed Judah well. He let events take their course. It was the same patience he had shown during his years as a fugitive, the patience of a man who trusted that God would fulfill his promises without David having to force the outcome. The turning point came when Abner, after a falling out with Ishbosheth, decided to switch sides and bring the northern tribes over to David. David received him and sent him away in peace. But Joab, David's military commander, had a personal grudge against Abner. Joab lured Abner back and murdered him. David was furious. He publicly condemned Joab and declared himself and his kingdom innocent of Abner's blood. In 2 Samuel 3:28 and 29, David said, "I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner. May it fall on the head of Joab and on his whole family." Not long after, Ishbosheth was assassinated by two of his own captains. They brought his head to David at Hebron, expecting a reward. David's response was brutal. In 2 Samuel 4:9 through 12, David said, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, when someone told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death. That was the reward I gave him. How much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed?" David ordered the two assassins executed. This is a pattern you see throughout David's life. He refused to benefit from violence against the Lord's anointed or against innocent people, even when that violence technically served his interests. It was a principle he held to firmly, and it earned him the trust of the entire nation. With Ishbosheth dead, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron. In 2 Samuel 5:1 through 3, they said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.'" David made a covenant with the elders, and they anointed him king over all Israel. He was 30 years old. The promise God had made through Samuel all those years ago in Jesse's house had finally come true. One of David's first moves as king of unified Israel was brilliant. He set his sights on Jerusalem. Jerusalem at the time was controlled by the Jebusites and had never belonged to any tribe of Israel. The Jebusites were so confident in their fortifications that they taunted David. "You will not get in here," they said. "Even the blind and the lame can keep you out." David took the city anyway. The choice was strategically genius. Jerusalem sat on the border between the northern and southern tribes. Because it had no previous association with any particular tribe, it could serve as a neutral capital for the entire nation. It was David's city from the start, belonging to all Israel equally. After securing Jerusalem, David had to deal with the Philistines. When they heard that David had been anointed king over all Israel, they mobilized their full army to come after him. David, as he always did, consulted God before acting. In 2 Samuel 5:19, David asked, "Shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hands?" And God answered, "Go, for I will surely deliver the Philistines into your hands." David defeated them decisively. The Philistines abandoned their idols on the battlefield, and David and his men carried them away. It was a military and spiritual victory all at once. With the nation unified and the capital established, David turned to something that was close to his heart. He wanted to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. The Ark was the most sacred object in Israel's worship. It represented the presence of God among his people. For years, it had been sitting in obscurity, far from the center of national life. David wanted to change that. His first attempt went badly wrong. They loaded the ark onto a new cart pulled by oxen. As the procession moved along, the oxen stumbled, and a man named Uzzah reached out to steady the ark. In 2 Samuel 6:7, we read that the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act, and God struck him down. He died right there beside the ark. David was shocked and afraid. He did not understand what had happened, and he was angry. He left the ark at the house of a man named Obed-Edom and went home. For 3 months, the ark stayed there. During that time, David reflected and studied. He realized that God had given specific instructions about how the ark was to be transported, carried by Levites on poles, not hauled on a cart. Uzzah's death was a harsh reminder that approaching God required reverence and obedience, not just good intentions. When David tried again, he did it right. The Levites carried the ark on their shoulders as God had commanded, and the celebration that accompanied the procession into Jerusalem was spectacular. 2 Samuel 6:14 and 15 tell us that David, wearing a linen ephod, danced before the Lord with all his might. He and all Israel brought up the ark with shouts and the sound of trumpets. David was not performing for a crowd. He was worshipping God with everything he had, completely abandoned to joy. Not everyone appreciated it. Michal, David's wife and Saul's daughter, watched from a window and despised David for what she saw as undignified behavior. When she confronted him, David's response was sharp. He said, "It was before the Lord, who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house, when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes." David did not care about looking dignified. He cared about worshiping God. With the ark in Jerusalem, David had another idea. He wanted to build a permanent temple to house it. He was living in a palace made of cedar, and it bothered him that the ark of God was sitting in a tent. He shared this plan with the prophet Nathan, who initially told him to go ahead. But that night, God spoke to Nathan with a different message. God told David, "You are not the one to build a house for me." But then God made David a promise that would echo through the centuries. In 2 Samuel 7:11 through 16, God said, "The Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." This promise is known as the Davidic covenant, and it is one of the most important moments in the entire Bible. God was not just talking about Solomon. He was pointing far into the future to a descendant of David who would establish an eternal kingdom. For believers, that promise found its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ, who the New Testament calls the Son of David. David's response to this promise was a prayer of complete humility. In 2 Samuel 7:18 and 19, David sat before the Lord and said, "Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family, that you have brought me this far? And as if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant." This was David at his best, overwhelmed by grace, aware of how undeserving he was, grateful beyond words. As king, David expanded Israel's territory through a series of military campaigns. 2 Samuel 8 records his victories. He defeated the Moabites, the king of Zobah, the Arameans of Damascus, and others. The text repeatedly says, "The Lord gave David victory wherever he went." He dedicated the war plunder to the Lord. David also showed remarkable compassion. In 2 Samuel 9, he asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" He found Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, who was crippled in both feet. When Mephibosheth was brought before the king, he fell on his face in fear. He had every reason to be afraid. In the ancient world, when a new dynasty took power, the surviving members of the old royal family were usually killed. Mephibosheth expected to die. Instead, David said, "Do not be afraid. I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Mephibosheth was stunned. "What is your servant," he said, "that you should notice a dead dog like me?" David restored all of Saul's land to Mephibosheth, assigned servants to work the land for him, and gave him a permanent place at the king's table. He treated his dead friend's son like his own family. David kept the promise he had made to Jonathan years earlier, when both of them were young and the future was uncertain. That kind of loyalty says a great deal about a man's character. This was the high point of David's reign. The kingdom was unified, expanding, prosperous, and centered on the worship of God. David had everything, and that is exactly when everything fell apart. 2 Samuel 11 opens with a single devastating sentence. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. But David remained in Jerusalem. David was supposed to be with his troops. Instead, he stayed home. And one evening, he got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was beautiful. Her name was Bathsheba, and she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's most loyal soldiers, currently fighting on the front lines. David sent messengers to bring Bathsheba to him. He slept with her. She became pregnant. What happened next was a desperate cover-up that spiraled into murder. David's first move was to recall Uriah from the battlefield, hoping he would go home to his wife and later believe the child was his. But Uriah refused to go home. In 2 Samuel 11:11, Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my lord Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and sleep with my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." The irony is suffocating. Uriah the soldier showed more integrity in that one sentence than David the king had shown in weeks. When his first plan failed, David made a choice that crossed a line there was no coming back from. He wrote a letter to Joab, his commander, and sent it back to the battlefield with Uriah himself. The letter said, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." But the consequences were set in motion, and they would be severe. The child became ill. David fasted and prayed for 7 days, lying on the ground, begging God to spare the baby. On the 7th day, the child died. David's servants were afraid to tell him, worried about what he might do. But David surprised them. He got up, washed himself, changed his clothes, and went into the house of the Lord to worship. Then he ate. When his servants asked why, David said, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." Even in his deepest grief, David worshipped. Even after his worst failure, he turned toward God, not away from him. But the consequences Nathan prophesied were only beginning. David's son Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar. David was furious but did nothing about it. His son Absalom, Tamar's full brother, waited 2 years and then murdered Amnon in revenge. Absalom then fled the country. David was caught in an impossible situation. He had lost one son to murder, another son was the murderer, and a daughter had been violated. The sword was tearing his family apart, just as Nathan had predicted. Absalom eventually returned to Jerusalem, but instead of reconciling with his father, he began secretly building a political following. He was handsome, charismatic, and ambitious. In all of Israel, there was not a man so praised for his good looks as Absalom. He grew his hair long, and once a year when he cut it, the hair weighed about 2.5 kilograms. People were drawn to him. He had the looks, the presence, and the royal bloodline. Absalom positioned himself at the city gate every morning, intercepted people who were coming to see the king for justice, and told them, "Your claims are valid, but there is no representative of the king to hear you. If only I were appointed judge in the land, everyone with a complaint could come to me, and I would see they received justice." And whenever someone approached him and bowed down, Absalom would reach out, take their hand, and kiss them. It was a calculated political campaign, and it worked brilliantly. 2 Samuel 15:6 says Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. When the time was right, Absalom declared himself king at Hebron and marched on Jerusalem with a growing army. David, realizing the threat was real, made the agonizing decision to flee his own capital. 2 Samuel 15:30 paints a devastating picture. David went up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too, and were weeping as they went up. During his flight, a man named Shimei from Saul's family came out and cursed David, throwing stones and dirt at him. David's men wanted to kill Shimei, but David stopped them. "Leave him alone," David said. "Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look on my misery and restore to me his covenant blessing instead of his curse today." Even in humiliation and exile, David submitted to God's will. The civil war ended with Absalom's death. Against David's explicit orders to spare his son, Joab found Absalom hanging by his hair in a tree and killed him. When David received the news, his reaction was one of the most gut-wrenching moments in the entire Bible. 2 Samuel 18:33 says the king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." David won the war, but he lost his boy, and for a father, that was no victory at all. David returned to Jerusalem and continued to reign, but the scars from these years never fully healed. His family remained fractured, and the consequences of his choices continued to ripple outward. Near the end of his reign, David made another serious error. He ordered a census of Israel's fighting men. The text does not fully explain why this was wrong, but the implication is that David was relying on the size of his army rather than trusting in God. In 2 Samuel 24:10, David was conscience-stricken after the count and said, "I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing." God gave David a choice of 3 punishments. David chose 3 days of plague rather than falling into the hands of men. The plague killed 70,000 Israelites before God stopped it. David built an altar at the threshing floor where the plague ended and offered sacrifices. That very site would later become the location of Solomon's temple. In his final years, David poured his energy into preparing for the temple he would never build. This is one of the most admirable things about David. God told him he could not build the temple. Many leaders would have been bitter about that. They would have walked away from the project entirely. If I cannot get the credit, why bother? David did the opposite. He threw himself into the preparations with everything he had. He gathered staggering amounts of resources. In 1 Chronicles 22:14, David said, "I have taken great pains to provide for the temple of the Lord. 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, and quantities of bronze and iron too great to be weighed." He organized the Levites and priests into shifts. He arranged the musicians and singers. He planned the gatekeepers. Every detail of the temple worship was mapped out so that Solomon would have everything he needed to complete the project. David did all of this knowing he would never see the finished building. He did it because it mattered to God, and that was enough. When the question of succession arose, David's son Adonijah attempted to seize the throne without his father's blessing. David responded decisively. He ordered the priest Zadok, the prophet Nathan, and the commander Benaiah to take Solomon to Gihon, anoint him king, blow the trumpet and declare, "Long live King Solomon." It was done. Solomon was established as David's successor. David's final words to Solomon are recorded in 1 Kings 2:2-4. He said, "I am about to go the way of all the earth. So be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him, and keep his decrees, commands, laws, and regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, so that the Lord may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live and walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel." David's very last public act was a prayer before the entire assembly of Israel. In 1 Chronicles 29:10 through 13, David said, "Praise be to you, Lord, the God of our father Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. Yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor, for everything in heaven and earth is yours. Yours, Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all. Wealth and honor come from you. You are the ruler of all things. In your hands are strength and power to exalt and give strength to all. Now, our God, we give you thanks and praise your glorious name." 1 Kings 2:10 and 11 record the end. David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. He had reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. David left behind a transformed nation. He united 12 fractious tribes into a single kingdom. He established Jerusalem as both the political and spiritual center of Israel. He expanded the borders, secured the frontiers, and built alliances with neighboring states. When David took the throne, Israel was a loose collection of tribes, constantly threatened by their neighbors. When he died, it was the dominant power in the region. He also left behind the Psalms. Many of these prayers and songs are attributed to David, and they cover the full range of human experience: joy, grief, fear, confidence, anger, gratitude, despair, hope. They were not written by a theologian in a comfortable study. They were written by a man on the run, a man in battle, a man on his knees begging forgiveness, a man dancing with abandon before God. That is why the Psalms still speak to people thousands of years later. They are real. They sound like someone actually lived them because someone did. The Psalms became the hymn book of Israel's worship. Generations of believers have turned to them in their darkest hours and found words that matched their own pain. Millions of people across centuries and cultures have read Psalm 23 at funerals, whispered Psalm 51 in repentance, and sung Psalm 100 in celebration. David gave the world a language for talking to God that has never been improved upon, and David's bloodline carried a promise that outlasted his kingdom. God's covenant with David pointed to a descendant who would reign forever. Matthew 1:1 opens the New Testament with these words: "This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." Throughout the Gospels, Jesus is called the Son of David. The eternal kingdom God promised was not fulfilled by Solomon or any earthly king. It was fulfilled by the carpenter from Nazareth, who was born in David's hometown of Bethlehem. David's life was not a clean, tidy success story. It was messy and complicated and often painful. He was a shepherd, a musician, a warrior, a fugitive, a king, a sinner, and a worshipper. He killed a giant and murdered a friend. He wrote psalms of breathtaking beauty and committed acts of terrible cruelty. He was generous and petty, brave and cowardly, faithful and unfaithful. But through all of it, one thing stayed constant. When David fell, he got back up. When he sinned, he repented. When he failed, he turned toward God rather than away. That is why, despite everything, the Bible calls him a man after God's own heart. It was not because he was perfect. It was because his heart kept coming back. David's story speaks to anyone who has ever felt overlooked, anyone who has waited years for a promise that seemed like it would never come, anyone who has faced a giant and felt completely outmatched, anyone who has made a terrible mistake and wondered if God could ever use them again. The answer from David's life is clear. God does not wait for perfect people. He works with willing ones. He takes shepherds and makes them kings. He takes failures and writes redemption stories. He takes broken hearts and makes them sing. If you found this story meaningful, take a moment to hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have not already, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss what is coming next. We have more stories like this one, stories that will challenge you, encourage you, and remind you that God is still at work, even when you cannot see it. Until next time, stay blessed.